Hello everyone, welcome to this talk about DevToolKit. My name is Guillaume Shaw, I'm part of the Vue.js core team, and you can find me on X and GitHub with my handle Acryam. So there's been a lot of new dev tools in the Vue.js community. So for example, we got amazing Next DevTools, which you can open in any Next project, and it's gonna display a lot of information about your Next application, which is pretty cool. And there's also the new Vue DevTools, which is pretty similar and using the same ideas of a button on your page to display the DevTools. It can also be installed as an extension or as a standalone application. So those new DevTools are amazing, but they are different and they are not fully compatible with each other. So that's why we started working on this new idea of a dev toolkit. So the goals of this dev toolkit is to unify the DevTools under a common set of utilities and APIs, and to also make them compatible with each other so that you can find the component inspector from the Vue.js DevTool inside the Next DevTools, or you could find the Next routes from the Next DevTools inside the Vue.js DevTools in the future. And also we want to make it easier to build DevTools in the first place for any other frameworks. It's basically going to be an SDK to create DevTools. With it, you can create DevTools for any framework, so not just Next or Vue.js, and it's going to support a lot of different environments. Creating DevTools is a pretty complex task. Everything I'm going to show is work in progress, so we're still figuring out what the APIs look like. So anything can change between now and when the SDK is going to be stable. So DevTools is a tricky thing to solve because a user application can be in any kind of different situations, and the development involves a lot of different environments like the browser or the Node.js server where you have the Vite server, or an extension or a standalone application. So that's a lot of different environments. To make sure that every kind of situation is supported is a little bit tricky, and the new SDK is going to help a lot with that. So this example is basically the current Next DevTools situation, where you have the Vite server and you have both the application and the Next DevTools inside the browser page. In this other example, we can see the current situation with the DevTools for Vue.js, which are displayed inside the browser extension. This example is a little bit different because here it's in the case of using the standalone version of the Vue.js DevTools, where it's running inside an Electron app, basically, so you can use it in any browser or even native script. And you can also use it if you build the application and publish it into a staging environment. And this last example is if you have the staging environment and you're using the Vue.js extension. So that's a lot of different situations and different environments to handle. The new SDK is going to be very helpful for that. So basically an applet is a debugging feature inside the DevTools. So for example, you could have an applet to inspect Vue.js components, or you could have an applet to inspect the Nitro routes from the next application, and together they becomes the DevTools you're using to debug your application. So here's an example of an applet, and it can have different kind of modules, which are here a main module, and page module, and a view module, and they all communicate with the core experience of the DevTools. So if, for example, you're using the Next DevTools, the core here is going to be the UI provided by Next. So currently there are 4 types of applet modules. So the main one is going to be the one registering the page modules. and also the tabs in the DevTools, the views, the commands, and basically the main API for the applet. You can also have page modules, which are gonna live in the same context of the user application, so you can interact with it. And then you're gonna have view modules, which are basically the visible part of your applet. So for example, a component inspector with the tree and the state inspector. And you're gonna have some server module as well, which are going to be mocked if you build your application with DevTools enabled. So I'm gonna show a little bit of code during this talk, but it's still work in progress and everything is subject to change. The main module is going to be the one registering page modules, but it can also add views or commands on other things. And it's gonna initially be run inside the Vite context, but it can also run inside the application page if you, for example, build the application while still enabling the DevTools and put it into a staging environment. So let's see here. I have an example of an applet for the DevTools. So this applet is basically split into two parts. So you have here the different JavaScript files that are going to be used by the DevTools. And there's also a view, which is a small view application, which will display some basic interface to the user. So the main module here is gonna first register the page module for my applet. And then I'm gonna also expose this function, and it will be available to the other module of the applet. And then I'm creating a channel to the page module, a channel to the view module, and calling a function from the page module here, and then also creating a few views to display, usually in tabs, in the DevTools. But it's up to the core experience how to display those views. So it could be something different. So next we have the page module, which is very useful because it lives in the same environment as the user application, which is why you can interact with it to, for example, fetch, store state, or call functions that are declared in the user application. You can also interact with the page DOM if you need. You can also use the general API to register new tabs or new commands like the main module. So let's take a look at our page module here. So this module is going to expose two functions here, but this function is more interesting because it's actually interacting with the view application on the page to fetch the store state. And then I'm creating a few channels to the main, the view, and the server modules, and creating a few buttons to test the communication between the modules here. And similar to the main module, I'm also adding a few tabs. And this one is very interesting because it's the view application inside the applet. So if we take a look at our application, we can see that I have the 4 buttons added by the page module that allows us to test if we can communicate between the different modules. So if I click on this one, we can see that I received the information from the main module here, which currently lives inside my Vite server on Node.js, so not in the browser. Next, we have the view module, which is the visible part of the applet. It's going to be displayed inside Dev2 tab. And it's going to, in our case, be a view application displaying the user interface to interact with the store. So in our demo here, it's going to be a simple view application, nothing special, but it can call functions from other modules. So in this example, I'm creating a channel to the main module and the page module, but we're going to use mostly the page module. And it also exposes a few functions that can be called by other modules as well. This one is pretty interesting because it will allow the page module to push new state to the view to automatically update the inspector. And in this view component, I'm manually calling the function from the page module here. So if we go back to the page module, we can see that I'm directly calling the function from the view to push new state for this automatic update to work. Here, I have a simple UI for the DevTool core experience. In this Pinia tab, I can see the view component rendering here. In our user application, we can see a simple store with a counter. And if I increment the store, we can see that the state is gonna be updated through the page module, which then sends the update to the view module here. So we can see that it updates automatically. And finally, we'll have the server modules, which are very useful to send information that we only have access to during development. For example, in the Nux application, we could list the Nitro routes, or we could use any Node API because this module is going to run only in a Node environment. If we build our application to production, but still enabling the DevTools, we can mock all of the calls made to the server module so that we still have the Nitro routes, for example, in our staging environment. So if we go back to our code, we can see here that I'm using a Node API to release the files in the project. But then in production, I'm gonna write the results of this call into a static file used while building the application, so that when the application is running in the browser on a staging environment, it can still have the list of the files using initially the Node API, which is no longer available because we no longer have a Vite server in our staging environment. The DevToolkit provides us with a managed communication system that allows all of those modules to communicate. Even if we are in the main module, we can call a function from the view module or a function from the page module, and everything can communicate. So this communication system is basically a remote procedure call system where you can call the functions from other modules just like if there were functions in the same context. Any module can communicate with any other module. The view can communicate with the server or the main or the page, and it's bidirectional, so the page can also call methods from the view. And it's fully typed, so if you are using TypeScript, you can see all of the types coming back from the calls. So if we look at this one, for example, we can see that TypeScript got the types. We return a state object. And if we take a look at the page module here, we can see that the function returns a state object. So currently we have a few communication channels that DevToolkit is gonna use automatically between the different modules. So we have the direct one, which is useful if two modules are in the same context. So for example, if the main and the server modules are in the same Vite server, and then you can use post message. For example, if you have the view inside the browser DevTools and you have the page, you need to use post message to communicate. And then you can also use WebSockets, which is the standard to communicate between the browser and the Node server. If you are using Vite, use also the HTML API to communicate, which is also using WebSockets. Thanks to the mocks that we can do for the server calls, we can imagine in the future having the next DevTools running in a staging environment where you can still see the Nitro rules or anything related to the Vite server inside the DevTools. Here's a little summary of the main APIs that you can use in the applet. So obviously this communication system, but also the views. They can be iframes or commands or terminals or inspectors, which allows any library inside an application to integrate with the DevTools, even if they are not specifically made for the framework. So we can imagine having a DevTools implemented in Svelte, displaying a store from a Pinia store in a Vue application, which is kind of crazy. And then you can also have commands, actions, and prompts that helps with usage of the DevTools using a palette, for example. And those applets are basically small bricks that you can assemble to create a much bigger DevTool experience. So we can imagine in the future mixing and matching different kinds of applets for different kinds of tools or frameworks and create a super version of the DevTools tailored for your specific use case. So, for example, we could have the component inspector from the Vue.js DevTools and the modules inspector from the Next DevTools, or a Tailwind DevTool or a Storybook DevTool, and have them automatically appear in your Vue.js DevTools. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this talk, and you can find me on Twitter or GitHub with Acrium. Thanks a lot.